Good afternoon. I'm Alan Lynn. I'm an NPS trustee. I have a wide interest in philosophy. Haven't quite tied myself to a mast yet. When I do, I'm sure it'll be critical and interested in emancipation in some way. I will be the chair for this session and for the next session. Personally, I'd like to thank the organisers, the co-organisers. It's been very enjoyable to set this up. Next, I'd like to thank Zoe Waters and Barbara for a stimulating session that we just had. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lorenzo Chiesa. Is that how we would say it, Chiesa, or?
Correct.
Is that?
Yeah.
Great. Ah, good old Google, yes. So Dr. Lorenzo Chiesa, who'll present his talk, The Future of an Illusion, Revisiting Freud on Religion. Now, Lorenzo is a lecturer of philosophy at Newcastle University, a philosopher and critical theorist, has a strong interest in Lacan, which the work has been mentioned by Zizek. His duties at the University of Newcastle see him as the Director of Postgraduate Studies, and he's the co-convener, something that I might be quite interested in, I imagine, the co-convener of the faculty research group, although I wouldn't be allowed in, of critical theory and practice at Newcastle University. He's also a visiting professor at the New Leading Thinkers Programme for the European Graduate School and at the MA PhD Socio-Political Philosophy Programme at the European University at St. Petersburg. On a personal note, quite looking forward to today, because often when I'm reading my broad view of philosophy, I always think, someone saying Lacan would say this or Freud would say that, and I always think, I'll circle back to that, but I very rarely do. So it's something that I really need to make a commitment to. So that's the start of this now. So questions in the Q&A, and over to you, Dr. Lorenzo Chiesa.
Thank you, Alan, and all of you for your kind invitation. Now, the paper I'm presenting today is a abridged version of the preface of the book I am currently completing. To give you a bit of context, the title of the book, co-authored with Adrian Johnston, is God is Undead. The main argument of my part of the book is, in a nutshell, that a practical atheism is best supported by theoretical agnosticism, and that B, what I call weak atheism, is eventually a form of theism. Now, the volume mostly centers on Jacques Lacan, yet the preface to the volume and my paper today takes a step back. It does question Freud's alleged atheism by means of a close reading of some of the, I would say, tensions present in his famous or infamous 1927 book, The Future of an Illusion. Now, the paper is divided into 8 sections. The title of the first section of the paper is Illusion and Delusion. Famously, in The Future of an Illusion, Freud claims that religion is an illusion. Far less famously, in the same context, he also specifies that illusions should be distinguished from delusions. Delusions are manifestly in conflict with reality and belong to the field of psychiatry. Illusions, instead, are equally sustained by deep-seated subjective wishes, but are not inevitably in conflict with reality. In this sense, and I quote Freud, an illusion is not the same as an error. It is indeed not necessarily an error, end of quote. So following a cautious logic of double negation, unlike a delusion, an illusion need not be unrealizable. Freud provides a series of strange examples to substantiate the difference and overlapping between illusion and delusion, which I could try to systematize as follows. A, illusions that proved delusional, such as Aristotle's belief that vermin evolved out of dung, and the belief that children are without sexuality. B, illusions that proved delusional, yet were somehow contingently matched by reality, such as Columbus's circumstantial discovery of America while trusting to be on a new sea route to India. C, illusions that increasingly appear non-delusional, as is the case with alchemy, to the extent that, quote Freud, modern chemistry no longer considers a transmutation of metals as impossible, end of quote. D, illusions that have come true. Now, with regard to this last instance, illusions that have come true, Freud bizarrely and in a Victorian fashion refers to a poor girl, quote, who may have an illusion that a prince will come and fetch her home. Freud then adds in all seriousness, it is possible some such cases have occurred. It is striking for us how Freud here immediately shifts his focus to religion. The prince at stake metonymically conjures up the Messiah. On the one hand, Freud argues the coming of the Messiah should be regarded as much less probable than the poor girls becoming a princess. On the other hand, we are invited to rationally contemplate the hypothesis that religious ideas may not necessarily turn out to be delusions. So epistemologically, the future of the illusion that religion is does not, for Freud, automatically entail the refutation of religion as an error. Throughout chapter 6 of The Future of an Illusion, the book, Freud prolongs and intensifies the seesaw, we could say, inherent to his overall argument. Some religious doctrines, as illusions, he says, are so far-fetched with regard to what we scientifically know about the world that we should treat them as de facto delusions. Yet, and this is interesting, with respect to other religious ideas, even most, he says, it is simply too early to make a call. We cannot judge their reality value. Quote, just as they cannot be proved, neither can they be refuted. We still know too little to approach them critically, end of quote. Now, in line with the same oscillation between an enthusiastic anticipation of the triumph of atheism and a persistent justification of agnosticism as more rational, Freud has almost unlimited faith in the progress of science, but his own arguments also indirectly expose the limits of science. Let's look at this. Scientific work is for Freud our only way to the refutation of religion. Scientific work will go as far as debunking the partisans, the supporters of the why not, namely those who ask, quote Freud, if even the crab skeptics admit that the statements of religion cannot be confuted by reason, why should I not believe them? End of quote. That is to say, science will, for Freud, conclusively demonstrate that, his phrase, ignorance is ignorance, and thus retrospectively persuade those we could call hypocritical theists that they are only deluding themselves into believing, when actually, on an unconscious level, they are already unbelievers, or we may say closet atheists. However, and this is more interesting for me, at the same time, science itself, Freud claims, can do nothing, both currently and in the future, against the supporters of what he calls the I believe because it is absurd to believe. In a different passage of The Future of an Illusion, the book, Freud discusses the credo quia absurdum, I believe because it is absurd to believe, of the early Christian fathers, and presents it as a sort of desperate, albeit high-handed effort of religion. Here, religious illusions, especially in terms of de facto delusions, are cheerfully embraced as avowed rational absurdities and taken as an irrational motivation to believe. As Freud puts it, the basic claim is that religious doctrines are outside reason's jurisdiction and stand above reason. For him, this position, the absurdist position we can call it, does not hold precisely because it amounts to a profession of belief or faith, not reason. But I would claim Freud does not seem to fully appreciate how it is precisely such a deliberate diminishing of reason that makes religious truths most irrefutable by definition for rationalists. In a sense, religion's last card, the absurdist one, is also its strongest. And yet, we witness to a further fluctuation in the general reasoning of The Future of an Illusion, the book. Freud's most conclusive words on the stance psychoanalysis and thought at large should adopt with regard to religious truths do seem to face the absurdist problem at stake, at least by opting to openly suspend it in an agnostic way. I quote, "It does not lie," Freud says, "within the scope of this inquiry to estimate the value of religious doctrines as truth," in italic, truth, end of quote. Instead, the social value of religion as an illusion must be investigated for Freud psychologically and superseded practically, not theoretically. On this ground, religion, on the practical ground, ought not to have a future. The title of the second section is As If, als ob, as if. Now, this brief introduction should already suffice, in my view, to alert us about the complexity of Freud's positioning vis-a-vis religion and God. Sympathetic readers such as Oscar Pfister and Christopher Hitchens are, for opposite motives, both wrong in their clear-cut assessments of Freud on religion. Against Pfister's attempted subsumption of psychoanalysis under Christianity, for Freud, religion, phenomenologically at least, remains for all concrete purposes an infantile disorder of civilization, in spite of its ultimate theoretical irrefutability. Against Hitchens' enlisting of Freud as his phrase, fifth horseman of anti-theism, Freud was not an unequivocally optimistic champion of a new enlightenment, although Freud would have gladly subscribed to Hitchens' slogan, "God is not great." We have always to bear in mind that The Future of an Illusion, the book, is not intended as a conclusive anti-religious manifesto. The book is in fact structured as a quasi-Platonic dialogue in which Freud anticipates and tackles, not always successfully, I would add, the objections of his potential opponents. As seen, Freud thinks he has rationally done with the hypocritical theist. Freud underestimates, but also somehow acknowledges the irrational unassailability of the absurdist position. Above all, third enemy, if you wish, once Freud has shifted his discussion to the pragmatic value of religion, the kind of critic he deals with most in depth is what I would name the conservative atheist. In short, according to the conservative atheist, religion as the opium of the people, created by the people, is indispensable for social control and averting chaos. Religious doctrines are untrue, but, quote Freud, this is the position of the conservative atheist, we are led to behave as if we believed in these fictions because of their supposedly unequaled importance for the maintenance of human society as such. End of quote. Now, we soon sense that the more Freud finds it difficult to rebut this stance, the stance of the conservative atheist, the less he manages to disguise his ethical and political contempt for the, we could say, cynical arguments the conservative atheist is putting forward. In the end, and not without some vertiginous oscillations we will analyze, it is precisely as a reversal of the conservative atheist hypothesis that Freud's overarching motto emerges between the lines. We could phrase this motto as, it is highly unlikely that God exists, but we cannot prove it. For the sake of humankind, let's try to behave as if there is no God. Now, Freud nonetheless shares with the conservative atheist the methodological separation of the epistemological and practical levels of religion. Moreover, they, Freud and the conservative atheist, both deem the practical level to be more important. As the conservative atheist himself bluntly puts it, it is a practical problem, not a question of reality value. But the conservative atheist takes theoretically for granted the absurdity of religion only to strengthen religion socially as a, on close inspection, self-interested fiction. Freud instead uses the undecidability concerning the theoretical truths of religion as a we could say lever to promote a irreligious social experiment based on education. Insofar as we can historically ascertain that immorality, no less than morality, has at all times found support in religion, Freud argues, theoretical agnosticism must give way to atheism as praxis. The next section, the title is Two Arguments Against Conservative Atheism. So let's dwell on this fictional, not so fictional, I have to add, actually, enemy Freud creates for himself in The Future of an Illusion. So two arguments against conservative atheism. Freud puts forward two interrelated arguments against those who claim that for social reasons we should behave as if religious doctrines were true, although we know they are not. The first argument is, I think, rather weak. The second is somehow stronger, but interestingly ends with Freud doubting the most convincing and pragmatic part of his own atheistic conclusion. Let's look at the first weak argument. So, the conservative atheist appears to be initially inclined, according to Freud, to openly tell the masses that there is no God, but that in order to prevent unrest, they should act as if there is one. Freud, who tacitly shares his elitist division between philosophers and the man whose thinking is not influenced by the wiles of philosophy, Freud objects that such a move, the conservative atheist move, would not work in the least. The masses, for Freud, will never accept the as if and would turn away in disdain. Freud here compares the masses with one of his sons, the painter, I don't know, who, when told that a fairy tale that fascinated him was not a true story, completely stopped paying attention to it. Now, this is a weak argument, I think. Here, Freud's assumption is naively pre-psychoanalytic. It clashes with some of the most basic tenets of his own theory of the unconscious and the notion of negation in particular. In short, why is this like a weak argument? Moving from a position of overt repression, for which God is not dead, to the recognition that God is dead, is, for psychoanalysis, far from sufficient to dispel the belief in God. The conscious acknowledgement that God is dead still inevitably evokes an unconscious clinging to God, however you may call God. Let's call it the one, completeness, the principle. To put it in more Lacanian terms, the unconscious truth that God is dead, or more specifically, the truth of incompleteness and of the absence of a meta-language, the unconscious truth that God is dead cannot but structurally sustain itself by, in turn, sustaining unconsciously the belief that God is alive. In this sense, for Lacan, God is unconscious. Or, paraphrasing Octave Manoni, I very well know that the universe is godless, but nonetheless. Thus, the masses Freud refers to will continue to uphold religious doctrines in spite of their claims to the opposite and ostensibly profane behaviors. Leaving aside this issue, which I think condenses Freud's severe underestimation of the power of religion, The Future of an Illusion, the book, advances a second argument against the conservative atheist about the reason why the strategy of the conservative atheist would prove ineffective. Freud seems to anticipate the prospect that the conservative atheist might be tempted not to inform the masses about the groundlessness of the theoretical truths of religion. Philosophers know they are untrue, yet in behaving as if they believed in them, humankind will by default remain religious, and civilization not descend into chaos. For Freud, this is not a viable solution either. On the one hand, he seems to be, rightly so, alarmed by the manipulative involutions of that such a paternalistic kind of leadership may give rise to, i.e., the opium of the people created by the people would actively and cynically be administered, managed by a restricted number of people. On the other hand, and most importantly for the overall economy of Freud's reasoning, this scenario fails to take into consideration that humankind is in any case fast abandoning, in 1927, religious fairy tales, and there really is no way back. Now, according to Freud, the best thing we can do in the present situation is therefore preparing the masses for the inevitable. This means instructing people about the necessary function religion has exercised in history and how best to overcome it, since we have finally reached adulthood, Freud says, as a species. So while it is undisputable that religion has contributed much toward restraining the asocial instincts, this was clearly still not enough. And we have come to a point where, quote Freud, the question arises whether we are right in considering religion necessary for mankind, end of quote. In a different passage, Freud goes even farther and states that, quote, he is prepared to defend the statement that culture now incurs a greater danger by maintaining its attitude to religion than by relinquishing it, end of quote. However, at the same time, Freud concedes that his pedagogical mission is incredibly difficult. In yet another passage of the book, when pressed by the conservative atheist to fully assume the potential consequences that a removal of religious inhibitions could entail for humans as beings ruled by passions, Freud both insists on the fact that our only hope for the future rests on the experiment of a non-religious education, and in short succession bitterly admits, quote, the possibility that I, Freud, am too chasing after an illusion, end of quote. All in all, Freud says, I do not know, and you cannot know either. So to sum up, the irreligious future of an illusion might well turn, even for Freud, into the illusion of a religion-free future. The next section deals with a question, and the question is helplessness or instinctual vigor, question mark. Freud provides us with two contrasting atheistic accounts of the socio-psychological origins of religion and the idea of God. According to the former, which he already delineates in a 1907 article, religion emerges out of a partial renunciation of our anti-social instincts. As for the latter, elaborated in The Future of an Illusion, religion derives from an attempt to cope with the helplessness of humankind before nature. Let's look at the first account. So, for Freud, religion should be regarded as an ambivalent compromise or compromise formation. It is based on a suppression of socially harmful instincts, without which civilization could not have been established. That, however, suppression always proves inadequate. Religious life thus amounts to an interminable process whereby suppression is inevitably followed by backsliding into sin, which in turn gives rise to penance. In this sense, religion stands for Freud as a, he says, universal obsessional neurosis, since obsession itself revolves around a similar unending conflict. The obsessional's repression of instincts is only partly successful, and he remains continuously threatened by temptations and an accompanying anxiety connected with the idea of punishment. This state of affairs, the compromise, coalesces for Freud in obsessional and religious ceremonials alike, which ceremonials should be understood as both a defense against the renewed temptation and the ill expected, but also simultaneously as a representation of something that is not yet forbidden. That is to say, they are displaced reproductions, the ceremonials, of the instincts they are designed to prevent, hence their nature as ambivalent compromises. Now, for Freud, such a compromise manifests itself more widely in religious practices in a twofold way. And this is where things become more interesting for me. First, the iniquities humankind renounce are projected onto the deities, onto gods, who are allowed to indulge in these iniquities. In their most elemental configurations, gods are evil. Second, humankind is itself not prevented from carrying out iniquities if it does so in the name of the deities, of the gods. The ambivalence of the religious compromise can therefore be summarized in one concise and quite nice sentence. Quote Freud, "All acts which religion forbids are committed in the name of religion," end of quote. In the end, religion, thus overall, contributes to the development of human civilization and dialectically also threatens it. Now, Freud's second and more sophisticated account of the socio-psychological origins of religion has at first sight much in common with the first. The arguments we've just proposed, coming from his 1907 article, are incorporated into those advanced later in The Future of an Illusion. But in my view, at least, the two ultimately clash. And their tension, if not contradiction, is tentatively solved only through a very dubious subterfuge. That is to say, and I will return to this, the idea of the father of the horde. Let's look at Freud's second account of the origins of religion. Again, for Freud, individuals are inherently enemies of civilization. Civilization must be defended against individuals. Because of that, civilization can only be built on an instinctual renunciation. And in this respect, religious ideas are both the most important part of civilization and a source of perpetual danger we should finally, today, 1927, have done with. Yet, in his second account of the origins of religion, Freud also unequivocally and repeatedly claims that religion originates as a protection not from asocial instincts, but a more fundamental coldness, cruelness, and callousness of nature. So what is primarily at stake in this genealogy of religion for Freud is our being helpless as a species biologically. The principal task of civilization as a whole is to defend us against nature. And religion in particular is, quote, born of the need to make tolerable the helplessness of man, ultimately by invariably furthering the illusion that wretched life in this world serves a higher purpose. from this perspective, it is only, and this is the tension I see in Freud, it is only in a derivative manner that religion also protects us from antisocial instincts. What is my point here? Well, it seems to me difficult to reconcile the precondition of a species-specific helplessness as a ground zero of our natural predicament with the assumption that there is too great instinctual vigor in humankind. What Freud fails to grasp is the Lacanian move whereby the antisocial instincts to be curbed duly coincide with our helplessness. Or better, the fact that religion as a man-made protection that soon turns into a Pandora box should be investigated starting precisely from our instinctual helplessness, our being derailed on the very level of the instincts. In other words, Freud, naively, in my view, still somehow believes in a human state of nature. Due to our hardwired antisocial as pre-social instincts, nature would, according to Freud, destroy us through what gives us satisfaction, that is, incest, cannibalism, and murder. This would be to the eventual libidinal benefit, according to Freud, and this is untenable in my view, of only one single person, the father of the horde, who could enjoy without restrictions. Freud, and this is where Freud becomes really problematic, for me at least, Freud ends up thus mitigating his right intuition of anthropological helplessness as irremediable, we could say, not wholeness, not oneness, by positing what? Well, an exceptional one, with a capital O, as a really existing historical figure. And this is where Lacan is brutal with Freud, with the old story of the father of the horde. We can return to this. In The Future of an Illusion, the father of the horde from Totem and Taboo strikes back and is updated by Freud in the guise of the tyrant, he says, or dictator, about whom Freud doesn't really say much in this book. We should infer, or at least I do infer, that Freud's atheistic assessment of the social origins and value of religion is itself permeated by a significant and unrecognized religious relapse. The next section, the fifth, is entitled The Past of an Illusion. Now, having outlined this general impasse in Freud's reasoning, which I think it does not manage to solve, what should nonetheless interest us the most here is Freud's specific step-by-step genealogy of religion as dependent on our structural and never fully eliminable natural helplessness. So let's delve into this idea of helplessness and how it is connected with religion and leave aside the tension I try to explain. Chapter 3 of The Future of an Illusion presents us with a temporal sequence that proceeds dialectically. The arguments are only sketched, but to me at least quite compelling. Nice to read this together with Nietzsche, for instance. The first and most basic form of defense against the brutality of nature is achieved, according to Freud, through a humanization of the elements of nature. More precisely, our desperate predicament would supposedly follow from the violent act of an evil will, Freud's phrase, which we can attempt to exercise, appease, and even bribe. This enables us to overcome a fundamental anxiety. In short, we are perhaps still, Freud says, defenseless, but no longer helplessly paralyzed. Unlike what claimed in his 1907 article, anxiety here in The Future of an Illusion appears to predate the temptation to indulge again in the instincts we renounced. But as in this earlier text, embryonic religion is closely related, again, to the projection, as we saw, of human iniquities onto transcendence, onto the gods. The second step in this genealogy involves, according to Freud, turning such a purely evil will into an ambivalent father figure. This alleviation of transcendent violence, which further reduces our impotence, would result for Freud from a social transposition of the fact that as children, we all both fear the father figure and rely on their protection. In the third stage, nature is for Freud detached from human evil insofar as we start to observe some regularity and order in nature's phenomena. Yet our helpless state persists, especially through the experience and symbolization of death. The preservation of our species, thus, still requires confidence in father-like gods, according to Freud. The latter are both instated as the lords of nature now and deemed inscrutable to the extent that we essentially remain helpless. At this point, fourth stage, thanks to the increasing separation of nature from gods, morality becomes the primary domain of religion. Having sedated the dangers of nature, gods must now make amends for the evils of society. The laws of civilization are credited to have divine origins and must be obeyed unconditionally. As divine, they also apply to nature in its entirety. In the end, this amounts to positing that the apparent meaninglessness of earthly life and its lingering human horrors should be subsumed under the conclusive meaning of an immortal and blissful life after death, which we could participate in. So in spite of its devious ways, Freud claims, there exists a superior intelligence at this stage of the development of religion, who is severe but benevolent. So to sum up these four stages, this genealogy of religion, we move, according to Freud, from 1, God as evil, to 2, God as ambivalent, to 3, God as inscrutable, to 4, God as severe but benevolent. It's quite nice. This state of affairs leads to the fifth and final stage for Freud, that is to say, the emergence of monotheism. If the moral laws that are divine also govern the whole universe, then there must eventually exist one divine being. Freud concludes that the monotheistic God is at the same time dialectically a return to the historical beginnings of religion as derived from our species-specific helplessness. That is to say, monotheism reveals the father nucleus of all religions. Most importantly, monotheism therefore epitomizes the way in which religious doctrines contain historical, genealogical truths that are, however, distorted and systematically disguised. And I quote Freud, as when we tell a child the newborn babies are brought by the stork. The sixth section of the paper is entitled The Present of an Illusion. So, for Freud, at present, religion can and must be overcome. It can be overcome because, in spite of our enduring structural helplessness, we are somewhat less helpless thanks to scientific progress. It must be overcome because, precisely in light of our increased control over nature, religion by now proves to be on the whole detrimental to the Homo sapiens species. Religion, in fact, stabilized our primordial helplessness by giving it a meaning, fundamentally, only at the cost of what we could call a volatile, libidinal economy of aggressiveness, which eventually, in turn, amounts to an announcement of helplessness. Freud is very dialectical without saying it. In short, the convoluted sublation of the evil will allegedly responsible for our predicament into a benevolent God and the prospect of a otherworldly life of bliss inevitably paves the way for the further division between the brotherly neighbor who worships the same God and the infidel enemy who does not and must be exterminated. Now, and this is crucial, Freud straightforwardly claims on at least 2 occasions that the overcoming of religion is now possible simply by acknowledging our helplessness. And I think this is a naive argument. And thus also acknowledging the material, biological basis on which the historical foundation of religion rests. Humankind, quote, will have to confess its utter helplessness and insignificant part in the working of the universe, end of quote. Another quote, he who humbly acquiesces in the insignificant part man plays in the universe is irreligious in the truest sense of the word, end of quote. Now, yet a number of more or less explicit and undeveloped tensions emerge in Freud's discussion in spite of this apparent conclusion. Let's look at them. First, as Freud has to concede to the conservative atheists, there is no guarantee that a scientifically mediated irreligious education will work. To begin with, we should aim at reducing to a minority the majority, Freud claims, of asocial religious asocial masses. At worst, we will have to conclude that this is unfeasible, and Freud's own future of an illusion proves illusory itself. At best, a future without religious illusions will be achieved only by means of a long-term transition. It is indeed hopeless for Freud to try and eradicate religion by force and at one blow. In this regard, the intriguingly great cultural experiment, Freud's phrase, carried out in the USSR leads us nowhere. Second, and quite surprisingly, in one isolated passage, Freud seems to be fully aware, and he's not aware of this in general, of the fact that science may well be transformed into a new religion, in the precise sense that science would dialectically both sublate helplessness and present it again in an enhanced form on another more dangerous level. Quote Freud, human creations are easy to destroy, and science and technical skill which have built them up can also be turned to their destruction, end of quote. Third complication, for Freud, the self-identification of technologically and militarily advanced Christian America with God's own country already anticipates for Freud in 1927 this contradictory status and passage concerning science. I move to the 7th section. The title is Optimism Without Foundation, Optimistic Enough. On close inspection, Freud's doubts about the effectiveness of non-religious education are even more deep-seated. In the final chapters of The Future of an Illusion, his oscillations, we could say, between hopeful optimism and anxious pessimism become extremely pronounced and, philosophically, I would say, almost uncontrollable. They close with a somehow forced, in my view, declaration of blind faith in science's capacity to eradicate religious practice. Let us summarize Freud's overall stance, and what follows is, for me, the most important part of the paper, these last 10 minutes. So, for Freud, religion is initially indispensable for communal existence. It gives a meaning to helpless meaninglessness. In providing information that should solve for us the riddles of the universe, religion offers some form of wish fulfillment. Religion also channels asocial instincts whilst remaining oxymoronically, a affective, Freud's phrase, affective instinctual renunciation. Still, religion has not made the greater part of humankind happy or moral. It has not turned humankind into, Freud, supporters of civilization. In addition to that, science is increasingly detecting religion's errors, and there is no stopping to this process. More knowledge equals less religion for Freud. If people do cling to religion, it is because of their obscurantist religious upbringing. An uninfluenced child would not bother about God and the afterlife. This is a Freud we all know, but if we delve deeper into the text, there's a series of but, and these are Freud's, for me, this vertiginous oscillation, but perhaps this child would anyway repeat the mistakes of his ancestors, but maybe he would not. And the intellectual degeneration of religion is only a secondary nature. But it could well be the case that this assumption stands itself for an illusion. I do not know, Freud says, and you cannot know either. But we should admit there is hope for the future, and the experiment of a non-religious education is worthwhile. But again, perhaps even the hopes, I'm quoting Freud, I have confessed, are of an illusory nature, end of quote. But, you see, like the continuous seesaw, but Freud's illusion would, in his view, still definitely not be delusional. Quote Freud, my illusions are not, like the religious ones, incapable of correction. They have no delusional character, end of quote. But probably non-religious education will not alter much our psychological religious nature in any case. And our, quote, God logos is not perhaps a very powerful one. But ultimately supported by science, we can increase our power since science has supposedly demonstrated in a conclusive manner that science is no illusion. Now, the political considerations, now I'm getting very critical of Freud. Now, the political considerations that accompany this disorienting seesaw are not only equally undecided and vertiginous, but also quite problematic in terms of what they end up proposing as a praxis. Already in the opening chapters of The Future of an Illusion, Freud's defense of culture seems to support, in my view, two incompatible libidinal economies. On the one hand, he thinks civilization should aim at diminishing instinctual sacrifices, identify those sacrifices that remain necessary, and compensate us for this renunciation. On the other hand, Freud appears not to be opposed to a less permissive civilization in which the superego is strengthened and, quote Freud, yet other wish gratifications which are today entirely permissible will appear just as disagreeable as those of cannibalism now, end of quote. The political question, the political practical question of the future of religion is itself suspiciously treated through a similar dichotomy. Freud's hesitations enable us to glimpse three different future scenarios. According to the first, non-religious education proves successful thanks to science. Useless religious prohibitions are revoked. The consolation of religion and the aggressive satisfaction that goes with religion are rationally renounced. This renunciation is compensated by the fact that laws become less rigid, which in turn prompts people to have a nice, more friendly attitude to laws and aim at improving them. Abandoning religion, thus amounts to a process of gradual social growth orchestrated by, Freud's phrase, sensible teachers who know how to temper the onset of a new development. As for the second scenario, evoked only in passing by Freud, the experiment, the irreligious experiment, proves unsatisfactory, and we return to religion. However, this is a possibility that Freud himself, elsewhere, we've seen that, categorically rules out as impracticable. In fact, the masses will soon infallibly discover that there is no God, even if they are not told about it. Freud's call for non-religious education, we've seen this, originates precisely from the assumption that the masses are ready to accept the results of scientific thought without being ready for it. It's a nice way of putting it. The masses are ready to accept the results of scientific thought without being ready for it, Freud says. This leads us to a third and very bleak scenario. As for Freud, I would argue, the only actual alternative to the liberal wager of a non-religious education. If we do not confide in the possible triumph of a non-religious education, and Freud's own reservations we've seen are far from minor, we should carry out, and I quote, this is the most disturbing Freud nobody mentions usually, we should carry out, quote, the most rigorous suppression of these dangerous masses and the most careful exclusion of all opportunities for mental awakening, end of quote. There is indeed eventually a very thin line separating Freud's aristocratic, misguided, and frankly indefensible socio-political position from that of the conservative atheist, his alter ego. I come to the final section, so 5 minutes more or so. The title of the final section is Comrades in Unbelief, Unglaubengenossen. Nice. German is very nice, usually, always. So, comrades in unbelief, atheism or agnosticism. So the final section will be more metaphysical, if you wish. And this leads to, at the end of the preface to my book, leads to the main themes of my book. So Freud's final eulogy of science and its logos does not go without a subtle and crucial retraction. That opens up again, we go back to the beginning of the presentation, the question of religious truth as epistemologically and ontologically undecidable. Now, for Freud, science is certainly no illusion. Although scientific ideas can be ameliorated, for him, they already provide us with an assured and most immutable core of knowledge that cannot be changed. Thanks also to the psychological insights of psychoanalysis, for Freud, science thereby leads our non-religious education as fundamentally based, we've seen that, on the acknowledgement of helplessness and aimed at the establishment of a non-oppressive or more tolerable civilization of comrades in unbelief, Unglaubensgenossen. Yet, and this is for me philosophically crucial and problematic, yet Freud specifies that science's task has to be procedurally confined to showing how the world must appear to us, the species. Since, he says, the question of the world, irrespective of our perspective, is just an empty abstraction without practical interest. So, comrades in unbelief must focus all their liberated efforts on a pragmatic improvement of earthly life, and should, for Freud, refrain from wasting energy, as we do, in metaphysical speculation. Freud's overall stance on atheism and agnosticism becomes here, for me, even more ambiguous. As seen, to sum up, it methodologically starts off with an agnostic delimitation of religious truth, which would lie beyond the scope of psychoanalytical and philosophical investigation. However, Freud subsequently, we've also seen this, appears to be claiming that psychoanalysis can deliver the historical truth, the genealogical truth, that religion is a man-made production revolving around human helplessness, which is already reflected for Freud in disguise within religion itself and can be confirmed beyond reasonable doubt by science. So recognizing all this would suffice to make us irreligious. But my question, does this mean that such a historical, genealogical truth about religion also provides us with the ultimate truth about religious truth? And that thus Freud's position is at bottom atheistic. To conclude, there are two further complications, and here we are in a very speculative realm. But in a sense, like the entire paper, leads to this point at the end of the day. So there are two further complications. First, well, to establish whether Freud is agnostic or atheistic, or as I will claim, is both a weak agnostic and a weak atheist. There are two further complications. First, by Freud's own admission, the above holds exclusively with respect to the word for us. His genealogy of religion holds only with respect to the word for us. Recall what we said about science. Helplessness, or we could say incompleteness in a more Lacanian manner, is scientifically the species' ultimate horizon. But we can ask, given that we are wasting efforts and being metaphysical, but might this very not oneness, incompleteness, be the one in the word as in itself, not for us? To the extent that in the very last page of The Future of an Illusion, Freud ends up evoking this metaphysical question, only to leave it aside for its supposed lack of practical value, his general orientation turns out to be, again, more agnostic than atheistic, in spite of and thanks to his full commitment to a scientific outlook. Second problem and complication, and this is my last point, even if we were to privilege the atheistic Freud, for whom a science that includes psychoanalysis would be enough to have done with religion once and for all, his atheism, Freud's atheism, remains, for a lack of a better word, weak. i.e., Freud does not realize how the conclusion, God is dead, or the not one is, incompleteness is, even if directly applied to the word as in itself and for itself, inevitably conjures up the one, completeness, a definitive religious meaning, or better, we could say, the God of atheists. The logos for which there is no meta-language is necessarily instated as a meta-linguistic statement. Freud, in my view, fails to confront the God that guarantees the death of God. Thank you very much.
Wow. Well, thank you. Wow. Very detailed and very motivational for my auspicious start. quite a start. So we've got some questions. I certainly have one, but we have a. Let me see. Not really a question. It's more of a statement. I guess we could get a question out of it from Michael. If I no longer love my wife, I could continue to act as if I do, be practically useful to keep pretending, but the pretense condemns her and perhaps me, Michael, to live a life of illusion. If I believe that God does not exist, I owe it to him and perhaps myself to openly accept his non-existence. So your thoughts on that?
Well, the problem has to do with the accepting the non-existence of God. This is like where the paper was heading to, and the entire project is about. The project, in a sense, is a critique of what I call weak atheism. So the whole problem, and I take Freud as an entrance into the problem, which is then discussed by means of Lacan and my own things, is precisely accepting the non-existence of God. So the basic claim here against Freud is that it's not enough to accept the non-existence of God, or even like the fact that you do not love your wife in order for that to be translated into the non-existence of God or non-love for your wife.
Yeah, there was implied throughout that you've got to do something with that. Well, that was my perception of it anyway. Yeah, there should be an action to. Yeah.
I mean, the basic argument, here is that God is dead, as you can, infer from a certain superficial reading of Nietzsche. God is dead is our religion in a way. Well, there's all question of, the resurgence and triumph of religion, which has imposed itself on civilization as such in the last, 30 years. But, in a nutshell, the argument is that an uncritical approach to atheism, God is dead, is no less theistic than God is alive, I believe in God. What it carried out is a kind of close reading of Freud showing the tensions. But that's one of the basic points I'm trying to put forward.
Great. Let me see. We have from Jacob. Thank you, Lorenzo. That was a brilliant talk. Freud's political proclivities seem to point to a form of technocracy, a problem with which, with the rise of Silicon Valley capitalism, I knew that word was going to pop up, in contemporary politics, becomes far more likely. To what extent do you think these new technocrats belong to the more problematic intellectual trajectories sketched out by Freud? Freud.
Yeah, I think one would need to substantiate the passage very quickly. And thanks, Jacob, as always, great questions. Silicon Valley bureaucrats as acephalic masters of today's society, I think we could, with some passages, include them into the conservative atheist position criticized by Freud. Having said that, also I'm trying to show that, in a sense, Freud disdains the conservative atheist, but then ends up socially and politically embracing a position which is very close to what I call conservative atheism. Simplifying things, but the belief that our new life is on Mars, Elon Musk, etc. I mean, one has to substantiate things here and make more passages. But yes, I think we are living in the realm of conservative atheism. I think that would be my answer. Today, not in 1927. That was a anticipation for Freud. So yeah, I think contemporary technocracy tends to be conservatively atheistic.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It certainly feels that way. Another question from Humphrey Jordan. How would you negotiate or supplant positions predicated on excess and the stratification this entails? How do you evade the battalion absence of myth as our contemporary myth? Hopefully that.
Thanks, Humphrey. Could you just repeat the question? I think I haven't got the.
Yes. How would you negotiate or supplant positions predicated on excess?
Okay.
And then there's that.
Yes, enhanced bataille. Well, in a sense, my critique of Freud's contradictory insistence in some of his works on instinctual vigor is a critique of excess. When I basically said Freud has two incompatible theories to account genealogically for the emergence of religion. One is based on biological helplessness. The other one is based on instinctual vigor. In a sense, these are the two directions that psychoanalysis after Freud have taken with regard to the question of excess. Or if you want to simplify, ontologically for some psychoanalysis, there is a kind of substantial vitalist presupposition. For another kind of psychoanalysis, mostly Lacanian, more materialist than realist, in my opinion, that very idea of excess as hardwired in terms of instinctual vigor, libido, if you wish, as a free-floating energy, is the wrong path, ontologically speaking, or anthropologically speaking, for psychoanalysis. My aim here was to say that, you know, like the battalion or anti-battalion veins of psychoanalysis, and in this sense, I would claim Lacan is very anti-battalion, are both present in Freud and makes his own basic philosophical anthropological position quite untenable.
Just to say that if Jacob would like to get some more depth on that, we can have him up to speak, ask himself some more in-depth questions if you'd like.
Yeah.
I would like to ask, you mentioned cannibalism, and there's not I made a jump with that and the kind of undead aspect of the title. So I mean, this is more of a pop. I've announced my inadequacies, but is there much of a link between this kind of like undead kind of cannibalism, or you might even say a zombieism, perhaps?
I can see why you're making the link, and thanks for the question, because that you know, gives an opportunity to understand, well, to explain what I mean by undead, even though it was not part of the paper. But no, I don't think there's that there's a clear link there. I mean, cannibalism, in a sense, has to do again with this assumption in Freud that, to begin with, in a kind of like pseudo state of nature, there is excessive, to go back to Humphrey's question, instinctual vigor. And that excessive instinctual vigor manifests itself fundamentally in self-destruction. So through nature, naturally, we are inclined, for Freud, towards forms of satisfaction which are self-destructive. And cannibalism is one of the examples he returns to continuously. Cannibalism, murder, incest, rape, etc. So cannibalism, well, fundamentally, Freud would claim, the wrong Freud would claim, in a state of nature, our fullest realization as Homo sapiens, but also our self-destruction, would be something like perpetual cannibalism. The question of the undead, for me, is a more ontological question. And thanks for the connection with the zombies, because this helps me clarifying where I stand on this Zizekian issue. And I think Slavo is quite misleading. The undead in Lacanian manner is I've written a couple of things about this issue, is the anti-zombie. That is to say, it's not, as I understand it, it's not the resurgence of life in what is dead, but the deadness of life itself. So from a pop perspective, it's, you know, like it's the opposite of the zombie. Is the process of perpetual destruction and putrefaction in a Sadian manner, anti-battalion, but Sadian manner, that is ongoing right now, as when life flourishes and thought flourishes. I think that strand of Lacan's psychoanalytical implicit ontology is incredibly interesting, also in connection with more, well, wider contemporary debates on realism and materialism. So the undead, so cannibalism is, in a sense, the self-destructive epitome of life, according to Freud, the wrong Freud, who believes in too great instinctual vigor. The undead is, for me, a ontological category to understand being as indifference at the end of the day, which I think one can approach through Lacan. And that's where Lacan and Freud, this goes back to Humphrey's question, are very different. What Lacan would accuse Freud of ontologically is precisely belief in the excess of life, the excess of being.
Great, that's great. I'll probably message you when I get that a bit clearer in my head. But yeah, that was great. And there's a question here from Nick. How, if at all, does your idea of weak atheism differ from Nietzsche's idea of free thinking as theistic atheism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like, I'm teaching a course on Paul and at the moment, and we also consider Nietzsche's critique of Paul. I mean, Nietzsche in general, from an ontological perspective, is quite different from what I'm trying to do, and I guess Nietzsche is very close to the Freud of vigor, even though from a much more solid philosophical standpoint. But in a way, I think Nietzsche would also sustain a critique of weak atheism. I mean, if you go back to the basics of the genealogy of morality and the emergence of Christianity as a slavish morality, etc., etc., and if you go back to the question of modernity with respect, in Nietzsche, with respect to what we should do with Christian morality, Nietzsche is very much aware, especially in the Antichrist, the book, that the big problem is not having done with Christianity, because modernity no longer believes, it's already in 1889, before 1927. Here, Nietzsche and Freud are very close. The problem is that I'm trying to be as close as possible to Nietzsche. I mean, I taught this like 3 weeks ago. The problem is that our psychology and physiology, as in a sense indistinguishable for Nietzsche, are by now Christian. So the death of God is not the real problem at the end of the day for Nietzsche. The death of the Christian God, or God to cure, is not the real problem for Nietzsche. He's very Freudian here. The problem is the void that the death of God opens, and the fact that in terms of identification and the ego, Freud would say, our ego is inextricably devaluing nature, in Nietzsche's term, or Christian. So I think like Nietzsche and Freud are here very, very, very close. But at the same time, I would say, so in a sense, like in Nietzsche, there is a critique of weak atheism. But what I mean by weak atheism takes a step farther. How to map that onto Nietzsche, I'm not sure, unless one, like delves into, well, the will to power and Nietzsche's most basic ontological presuppositions, which are a form of, however refined, vitalism. I hope I answered this question. It's an interesting question, but maybe I evidence like a connection Nietzsche-Freud, which is very clear here, I think. But whether Nietzsche is a weak atheist, yes, I think he is a weak atheist, because life is life. Life is life is life is life. Like Stephen Holgate, keeps on saying, and my first class is like 20 years ago, I was like an assistant to Stephen Holgate at work at EA to Stephen Holgate. And I think this is the whole point about vitalism. What is the message, the ontological message of vitalism? Life is 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 life. And coming from where I come from, that is already weak atheism. However, like chaotic or fractal that life may be. That was a very good question. So yeah, Nietzsche is aware of weak atheism. Nietzsche is aware of weak atheism because, in a sense, he's aware that to proclaim the death of God is just the beginning of the problem, not the end. But at the same time, from where I come, Nietzsche is himself a weak atheist, perhaps far less naive than Freud and his, like a blind faith in science, which, as a honest man, then he continuously problematizes and doubts.
Very good. Thank you. Well, we have probably a few more minutes if you'd like to flesh that out anymore, or if there's anything else you'd like to go over again. or we can go to the break.
No, I mean, if there are no questions, I mean, I think like to sum up, to wrap up things.
I have questions, but I need to form them. So I'll, yeah.
Sorry?
I have plenty, but I just need to form them properly in my own head from my super beginner position. But yeah, very interesting. Really got me going.
Yeah, I mean, like at the end of the day, I mean, the paper is both a new reading of The Future of an Illusion, because usually we take Freud on religion a la Hitchens, which is a wrong, hermeneutically speaking, reading. You know, like Freud is not just a partisan of new enlightenment. He is also quite an honest man. All his work is a work in progress. So we cannot just say Freud is a atheist a la Hitchens, or even worse, a la Dawkins. You know, like the weakest aspect of weak atheism is Richard Dawkins. You know, full stop. But at the same time, what I was trying to do here, this is a preface again to a book, so this is just the beginning of the problem, is to show, well, to insinuate without yet explaining in this part of the book what I mean by weak agnosticism and weak atheism. And Freud, for me, ends up in a position which is a position of undecidability between weak agnosticism, which is also a poor form of Kantianism in a way, and weak atheism. And these two positions are very insidious. You know, like Stephen Jay Gould, I guess like my number one scientist, he himself, with his non-overlapping magisterial theory, ends up with what they call weak agnosticism. That is to say, there is a space and realm for science and a space and realm for religion. I'm not religious, but we don't step into that. That's why I was saying that's a kind of like, like a poor Kantian. Weak atheism instead has to do with the non-acknowledgement of the problem of, my phrase, the God that guarantees there is no God, which becomes a much more interesting question.
We have another question from Humphrey. Sorry, I think I called you the wrong name earlier. Would Nietzsche's position be better phrased as life is lives, fractal, and thus disjunctive polytheism?
Yeah. No, I remember like having these discussions with Humphrey last year when he took my course. Yes, but that doesn't change things for me. I mean, it's just like a specification. Life is lives, plural, because it's chaotic, chaosmotic, fractal, does not change the question about a implicit principle. So we can, life with a capital L is lives, is life with capital L. You still go on a la Holgate with a basic ontological tautology, which is the basic ontological tautology of vitalism. So yes, that would be like more correct. What Humphrey says, like in order to summarize non-naive vitalism as a trend in thought. Like Nietzsche, clearly, Deleuze also.
And then it's like one last question. It's from Tonya. Hi and thanks. I found myself wondering whether there is anything in the Bible that requires one to believe in God or Jesus. There are a lot of instructions on how to pray, but that's not quite the same. So that might be a bit left field. I'm not sure.
If there's anything in the Bible that openly says that we need to believe, well, in the Christian Bible, definitely, yes. I mean, this is like the Pauline understanding of Jesus Christ's message. That is to say, there are three things, paraphrasing Paul, that matter: faith, love, and hope. But first and foremost, there's faith. To be a Christian means to believe in one specific thing: the embodiment, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's where things start. Then they get more complicated because there is no faith. Faith is nothing. Again, quoting Paul, faith is nothing without love. Then things become more interesting. But yeah, I mean, with regard to the Christian Bible, that is to say, the Gospels, the Acts of Apostles, but specifically Paul's epistles, which is the only proto-theological, non-anecdotal part of the Christian Bible. At the end of the day, there's nothing else. The Apocalypse, perhaps, the Revelation. But yes, I mean, I can't speak for the Jewish religion, or at least not right now, but being a Christian entails believing in the, to be more contemporary, event of the incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Wonderful. Right. Well, thank you. Thank you for your
Thank you,
time.
Alan.
It's been excellent.
Thank you all for the question.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Thank you all for the question.